October 1984, Desmond Tutu, South African Evangelical Archbishop, wins the Nobel Peace Prize. The Terminator, directed by James Cameron and starring Arnold Schwarzenegger and Linda Hamilton, was released in theatres. And Paul McCartney releases the soundtrack to Give My Regards to Broad Street. Ironically, in the same month of the same year, another former Beatle and Ringo Starr narrated the premiere episode of Thomas and Friends in the UK on the 9th of October 1984. This is a video about Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends Season 1. Most of the fandom know the story that I'm about to tell, but for the normies, here's some background information on how Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends came to be. As many people know, Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends was adapted from the Railway series children's books, written by the Reverend Wilbert Awdry and later his son Christopher. There was already 2 attempts to make Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends into live-action adaptations before 1984. The first one was a live BBC broadcast of the sad story of Henry in the 1950s, an incident which, according to reports, a train derailed live during the broadcast and was physically put back on the tracks. This incensed Wilbert Awdry and swore that there would never be another live-action adaptation of Thomas and Friends. Sadly, the footage is not available, either being taped over or archived. In the 1970s, Andrew Lloyd Webber proposed adapting a musical of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, which Wilbert declined. While a blow for Mr. Lloyd Webber, it did become the inspiration for the musical Starlight Express. It looked like Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends would never be adapted to the small or big screen until Miss Britt Allcroft came on the scene. Charmed by these books, Allcroft proposed adapting them into a TV series. After initially rejecting the idea, Awdry eventually came around and gave permission to be adapted into a TV series. Miss Allcroft is famously known for remortgaging her house to secure the funds to get the first series of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends in production and aired. A massive gamble at the time, but one that has paid off in great dividends ever since. Thus the search began for the production team. David Mitton and Robert Cardona joined the show as director and producer respectively. Then came time to find a narrator. After hearing Ringo Starr's voice, Miss Allcroft was convinced that he was the right person to voice this live-action adaptation. Initially, Ringo Starr refused because he hadn't read the books and was also unsure of how a TV series such as this would be successful in the 1980s market. Cartoons around this time were more bombastic, space operas, or fantasies. However, after reading the books, Ringo Starr was convinced and came on board. This is when the search for composers began. And the one little nugget of information that I can bring to the table that many of the fandom do not know. During my interview with Mike O'Donnell, I discovered that it was actually Ringo Starr that approached him with the idea of composing the soundtrack for Thomas and Friends, as Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell shared a recording studio with Ringo Starr at the time. He advised O'Donnell and Campbell to send a tape in to Miss Allcroft, initially composing the incidental theme music for Thomas, Edward, and Toby as audition tapes. Miss Allcroft liked what she heard, and they were brought on board. If you want to find out any more little tidbits from my interview with Mike O'Donnell, the link will be in the description of this video. After assembling the rest of the crew, including future director Steve Asquith, it was time to film the pilot episode, an adaptation of Down the Mine, which was test screened to ITV in mid-1983. One scene from the pilot is visible in the final product, which went into season 1. But once the series was greenlit, it was refilmed along with the rest of the series, with production starting shortly after, wrapping in 1984, and on the 9th of October, the first episode, Thomas and Gordon, was aired on UK television. Okay, for all the fandom, that's the preamble out of the way that you already know. And it's time for me to get into my thoughts on Thomas and Friends Season 1. I still love this season. Not a big shocker. While season 2 is my nostalgia bait season, and the one that I spent the first 5 years of my life growing up on, season 1 was also in that bracket. I mentioned in my history with Thomas and Friends video that my older brother initially had the videos when he was young. When I came along in 1987, the videos were handed down to me, and I fell in love with the series. A passion that has not died. Season 2 was my preferred season to watch on VHS, but season 1 was always a very close second. It had that warmth and comfort that you wanted from a first season, but for me, there was a lot of scary parts about Thomas and Friends season 1, especially as a young child. A lot of them were the close-up shots of the engine's resin faces. Now, the reason that the trains were given faces was so they were able to effectively emote with the target audience, communicating if they were happy, sad, or angry. And the close-up shots of the angry faces in particular scared the crap out of me as a kid. And apparently, they still scare the crap out of a lot of kids now. I've never admitted this before, but even now as a grown man, sometimes I have nightmares about those still image shots of the engine's angry faces. In particular, Gordon's. But that shows you how well this production team done with the first season of Thomas and Friends. The images created in 1984 can still spark such strong emotions in its audience in present day. Everything about the series is fantastic. The lighting, the cinematography, the score, the narration, the direction, the production values, they all still hold up, even in modern day. It's a show that if you watch this one season as its individual capsule and not watch anything else, it will hold up. You don't necessarily need to watch all of the following seasons and movies if you don't want to, because this series is insular. You can watch it, get to know the established characters, and if you don't want to carry on, you move on with your life. Speaking of said characters, we were introduced to the main 7 engines in season 1. A steam tram called Toby, a saddle tank named Percy, a mixed traffic engine named James, an express engine named Gordon, an interesting engine named Henry, one of the kindest, most helpful engines named Edward, and our main protagonist, Thomas the Tank Engine. Secondary characters include Bertie Bus, Terence the Tractor, coaches Annie and Clarabelle, and Henrietta. As well as the anthropomorphized engines and rolling stock, we were introduced to the one human character of relevance and importance to the show, Sir Topham Hatt, affectionately known by his engines as the Fat Controller. These characters, suffice it to say, played a pivotal role in the entire series from its first episodes to its last in season 24. Characters that we fell in love with because of their unique personalities. So I'm going to rank all 26 episodes of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends in season 1. Before I start, I want to clarify that just because an episode is at the bottom of this list, it doesn't mean that I hate it, because I do not hate any of the episodes in season 1. This season is fantastic. It's amazing. It's one that I still watch now as an adult to make me feel better when I struggle with my mental health. And even the lower ranked episodes of this season, I do not skip because I love it that much. These are all my own personal opinions, and your list will be different from mine. It's the one thing that makes the Thomas fandom so unique. And please let me know in the comments how you would rank Thomas and Friends season 1. All I ask is that you be respectful, and above all, enjoy the video. Okay, let's dive in. Number 26, Thomas and the Guard, or Thomas and the Conductor for international audiences. Thomas's impatience leads him to forgetting his guard, much to his coaches Annie and Clarabelle's disappointment. This is the lowest ranked because it's quite boring. I still enjoy the episode. I like how it establishes Thomas's branch line and some beautiful shots, especially of the river, of the fields, and it sets up the characters going forward. Thomas is in the new phase of his life, running his branch line along with his 2 coaches, Annie and Clarabelle. And it's a nice start as to what he's going to be getting up to during that time. It also sets up the ongoing season-long arc with Henry and his problems with him being unwell. But even now, when I watch it, I still have some questions around it. The main one is around the guard. It's established that Thomas goes quite far along his branch line before he's stopped at a signal. And yet very quickly, he catches up to this train. Did the guard have a secret life as the Flash that we didn't know about? That is really the only problem that I have though. The story is a bit boring and a bit mundane, but all in all, you learn to appreciate it more as you get older. Number 25, Thomas goes fishing. Thomas wants to go fishing, but he learns the hard way when he takes on river water. Again, another episode with some great visuals, but it is quite slow. It is very slice of life. Now there is some things that give me questions. For example, how were the fish still alive in Thomas's boiler? His boiler is scalding hot. Surely they would have burned to death. But apparently this is based on a real event, as a lot of Audrey's stories were, so it must have happened. So it must be something that I clearly don't know about. And from a modern day standpoint of the Fat Controller, the Inspector, Thomas's driver and fireman, all getting the fish out of the tank, and then having a supper of fish and chips straight afterwards, there's a lot of health and safety concerns there, guys. After being traumatized going fishing with my own granddad, may he rest in peace, I know that there is a lot of stuff to do around the fish before you eat it. You have to remove the head, you have to gut it, you have to scale it, you have to cook it. I know it's all condensed down, it's a children's story, but when you're an adult with a crazy brain like mine and you know about fishing, there's a lot of trauma in there. No wonder Thomas looked so terrified. And speaking of Thomas's look, this gets played on about a goof that is in there. A goof that Thomas has a resin face on of Percy's. Well, this resin face does become synonymous with Percy going forward. You didn't actually know that it was a goof at the time, because with the airing order and the season order, Percy doesn't come along until after this episode and then gets the resin face. So technically, Percy stole Thomas's face and just kept it. I know that's a little nitpick, but it's something that gets brought up a lot with goofs of this series, and I've been guilty of doing it myself. And then when I rewatch it, I realise certain characters hadn't turned up in a main capacity at this point in the franchise's history. So they had the resin faces first, and then passed it on to other engines. And there will be another one that we'll bring up later on in this video. Number 24, Thomas in Trouble, or Thomas Breaks the Rules for international audiences. Thomas gets in trouble with a policeman. When the Fat Controller hears about it, he buys Toby and Henrietta. The positive point right out the gate is that we get the resolution to Toby and the Stout Gentleman from the previous episode, and Toby and Henrietta become mainstays on the island of Sodor from this point forward. And if this episode did not happen, we would not have Toby and Henrietta. So I am over the moon with that, because I love Toby and Henrietta. That being said though, there are some parts about the episode that still don't sit well with me. It makes the police constable look like a right bellend. And yes, I don't like him, but there is a reason for it. He is grumpy because he didn't get a chance to sleep, and he does have his eyes closed on the job. And when Thomas blows his whistle, it wakes him up, makes him quite upset, and then he rightfully does his job because he notices that he doesn't have any cow catchers and needs them because it's part of the law. It may seem spiteful from this policeman because he's just reacting for Thomas waking him up, but he is doing his job. However, at the same time, the policeman shouldn't have been sleeping on the job. Even if he didn't get any rest the night before, he has to stay awake and man the line. If Thomas hadn't blasted his whistle and woke him up, potentially, we wouldn't have had the series of events that led to Toby and Henrietta coming to the island of Sodor. Thomas's driver, being a complete moron, mentions that they've been down the line hundreds of times and never had an accident. And of course, that does make the situation worse. And he is a regular lawbreaker. I understand the Fat Controller trying to defend his engines and trying to defend it all. But the policeman was right. The law is the law and you can't change it. I enjoyed the episode, and I do like the fact that it makes me think, and we also got Toby out of it as a result. So fair dues. Number 23, Thomas's Christmas party. Thomas wants to hold a special Christmas party for Mrs. Kindly. Unfortunately, Mrs. Kindly's house is snowed in, so he must assist Toby and Terence to help clear the snow. I have mentioned this previously, but the one thing I didn't like about this episode was that it was the second part of a two-parter where we never got the first part in its entirety. It's summed up very briefly in a flashback by all the engines. The reason that this is the second part of a two-parter is that the first part is from Railway Series book number 7, Toby the Tram Engine, Mrs. Kindly's Christmas. In this story, Mrs. Kindly warns Thomas about a landslide on his branch line and manages to stop a nasty accident. During this time, we find out that Miss Kindly is not well, and after Thomas and Toby clear the line, the Fat Controller, as a thank you to Miss Kindly, sends her off to Bournemouth to get better. I've actually summed this up probably in more detail than the episode actually did. And it was why it fell out of place for me, because I think we should have had the first part of this in season 1. They also mentioned that it's been a year since Mrs. Kindly's accident, and Toby, at this point in the series, has just arrived on the island of Sodor. So if you look at this in a timeline perspective, we have Dirty Objects as the 23rd episode, and that's around the same time as Mrs. Kindly's Christmas in the Railway series. Then we have 2 episodes after that, Off the Rails and Down the Mine, and then we have Thomas's Christmas Party. So in the space of 3 episodes, 1 year has supposedly passed. When you think about that, it doesn't make sense at all. It's only when I'm sitting here recording this now realising, hold on a minute, it's been 1 full year in the space of 4 episodes. I know that this episode came into prominence because they were wanting a Christmas special, but when you look at it back now, it just doesn't make sense. They should have had Mrs. Kindly's Christmas adapted into a full episode. It was set around Christmas time anyway, and then maybe done this Thomas's Christmas Party episode in the following season, and it would have been a great 2-parter, and a year would have passed. I don't know, guys, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but that's my job. It's kind of what I have to do. I still like the episode though. Number 22, Off the Rails, or Gordon Takes a Dip for international audiences. Gordon decides to jam the turntable to avoid taking a special train of trucks, but his attempt makes him slide into a ditch. Remember I was saying about how some of season 1 still gives me nightmares? The nighttime visuals when they're getting Gordon out of the ditch is one of those sequences that still gives me nightmares. Especially the final close-up shot of Gordon after he was pulled out of the ditch. It was also the first time you saw a tender engine without his tender. They pull Gordon out of the ditch and the tender is off. So for a kid, you're looking at Gordon missing a tender. It's like he's lost his legs. That's a bit of a nightmare visual. I've grown more and more fond of Off the Rails as I've gotten older and really appreciate how well they done that nighttime scene with the cinematography, because the fact that it can still give me nightmares as a grown man proves they done something right. And the episode is Gordon's ultimate fall from grace. In the books, it starts his character arc of turning into a wiser engine. This is the catalyst for it. You also see Henry and Gordon's sibling dynamic at the start of the episode. Henry winding up Gordon, and then Gordon getting a couple of cheap digs in at the end. Loved it. And of course you had the wee cameo from Percy. Number 21, The Sad Story of Henry, or Come Out Henry for international audiences. A big green tender engine named Henry believes the rain will spoil his paintwork, and he runs into a tunnel, in which he is eventually bricked up due to his refusal to come out. There's so much negativity around this episode. It's why it's brought down the list. The end sequence is pretty traumatizing if you don't watch the next episodes, because the next episode, spoiler alert for all the clickbaiters, Henry does come out of the tunnel in the next episode. It is something that gripes and irks a lot of the fandom, because this incident was used as a smear campaign on Thomas and Friends, saying that it was too traumatizing for children, part of some agenda to scare kids into conformity and discipline and control. Newsflash, kids do need disciplined. I'm a dad of twin boys. They need disciplined, and they do need a little bit of control to realise that their actions have consequences. That's parenting 101. You have to be disciplined with your kids. Otherwise, they're going to turn into little And like I said, Henry does get out of the tunnel at the end. But I will give these haters one little malcrum of evidence for their contrary plan. Originally, Henry was not meant to come out of the tunnel in the Railway series books. In the first book, The Three Railway Engines, Henry was intended to be bricked up and left there. But the publishers said that it was too dark an ending, and that Audrey had to write a story to not only release Henry from the tunnel, but bring the 3 central characters of Edward, Gordon and Henry together, because originally they were all going to be based on separate parts of the island. And because there is so much controversy and backstory around this episode and story, it's why the story actually comes down on the list. You're more intrigued about the behind the scenes stuff than you are about watching the actual story itself and taking in the story. I still love it though, and the ending sequence still brings a tear to my eye, although I do believe he did deserve his punishment. But that's the only reason. It's knocked down a bit because of all the crap that surrounds it. Number 20, Dirty Objects, or James in a Mess for international audiences. Toby and Henrietta often get teased by James about their old-fashioned appearance. However, James crashes into some tar wagons. Watch my James is a Bobag video and you'll understand some reasons as to why I don't particularly like his character. This is kind of one of the reasons why. James goes through an established character arc in his standalone episodes. Cocky git, fall from grace, redemption, job's a good one. However, he defaults back to type of being a complete bellend in the rest of the series. And this is one of the prime examples. It shows why I think James has a real prejudice against old people, because he looks at Toby and Henrietta and just thinks they're old, they're dirty, they're smelly. And of course that comes back and bites him in the tender in this episode, which was great. And the crash sequence was brilliant. And Toby just having his attitude of, I'll put you in your place with a snarky comment and then let karma work itself out. Beautiful. And Percy and Toby just ripping the absolute piss out of James after he's had his accident is class. Number 19, Whistles and Sneezes. Gordon feels foolish when his whistle jams, and Henry sneezes at some troublemaking boys. In this series, they would combine two Railway series stories into one episode. Whistles and Sneezes is one of them, and not the strongest one of this season. This is based on two Henry the Green Engine stories from the Railway series books, Gordon's Whistle and Henry's Sneeze. While it was inventive of how they were able to stitch these two together, I still think they would have done well as their own individual stories and own individual episodes. And there is a bit of dark behind the scenes lore around this as well, especially Henry's Sneeze. In the original Railway series book adaptation, when Henry sneezes at the boys that have been throwing stones at him, Audrey infamously wrote that the boys were black as word that I will not say. It begins with N. And this did not change until 1972, when publishers forced Audrey to do it. Now I understand it was a different time, and Audrey didn't understand the connotations of that word, but we do now, and thankfully it was changed to black as soot. But that just puts, ironically, a stain on this story and in turn this episode that, for my own conscience, I can't shake off. I do like the episode's story and premise and how they combined the two. And of course, the model making work is fantastic. Again, it's the behind the scenes stuff that actually influenced the ranking of this, because sadly, you can't separate one from the other at times. Number 18, James and the Express, or A Proud Day for James in international audiences. When Gordon is switched the wrong way and gets lost, James is given the Express. Okay, I don't get why Gordon gets all the flack for this incident. Yes, he was switched off the main line onto the loop, came round and back to the station, but it wasn't his fault. That would have been the signalman that done it. Because as we establish, Gordon is proud saying that he seems to know the right line by instinct, but the signalman switches the points so the engines run on the right lines. So it was the signalman's fault. But I get that the way the story is portrayed, that it's a humbling experience for Gordon, because he is constantly berating James, even though he's finally starting to get back in the good graces after his incidents in previous episodes. And it's to bring that round so that the engines respect him. But as I said in my top 10 worst episodes list, this episode wasn't needed. In James's previous episode, he earns the respect back of the Fat Controller. So his redemption was already complete. This was just a tag along. I understand that he would probably want his colleagues to respect him because that's the ones he works with on a daily basis. But not everybody likes the people that they work with. You just have to suck it up and get on with it. But overall, it's still okay. Number 17, Coal, or Henry's Special Coal for international audiences. Henry is not feeling well. The Fat Controller comes to a conclusion that Henry needs special Welsh coal to make steam. An episode that the behind the scenes lore makes it better. Originally, Henry was not going to be long for the Railway series world. He was illustrated wrong in the first book. then illustrated wrong again when a new illustrator took over, which caused Audrey to decide to make Henry not well so they could write him out. But fan letters concerned about Henry and hoping that he gets better made Audrey realise that he could work with this. And thus, these stories that Henry needed special coal and then eventually getting remade were born. And it's a great arc for Henry. You feel sympathy for him. You realise that he's not well and it's not his fault. It's how he was made. And he needs this to make him better. This special coal to make him the best version of himself. I relate to this as someone that suffers from mental health issues. There is a chemical imbalance in my brain, and I need to take medication to balance those scales out, to make me the best version of myself. It's why I relate so much to Henry in this. He gets ridiculed for being lazy, not working hard enough, being too expensive to fix and it not making him any better. I feel like that with my mental health. People do come up to me and just think I'm faking it to get out of work or I'm being lazy. But it's not something I can control. When they eventually find out that something is wrong with Henry, and a slight change can make him the best version of himself, and he goes out the way and proves his point, I feel a sense of catharsis with Henry. It's why, even though you do get the nice resolution of him getting remade, and he doesn't need the special coal anymore, I did feel a little bit sad when that happened, because that thing that I empathised with Henry was gone. It turned out he just needed a simple operation to make him better, and sadly that doesn't work for mental health people like me. But the episode of Coal is still really good. Number 17, Thomas, Terence and the Snow, or Terence the Tractor for international audiences. Thomas meets Terence the Tractor and says his caterpillar tracks are ugly. However, Thomas is shown just how useful they are when he crashes into a snowdrift. What I love about this episode, the setting changes from autumn to winter, and it shows how great the production staff and the directing from David Mitton were in this series. You're going from, yellow stubble and brown earth and leaves falling down from the trees to massive snowdrifts in the space of a 4.5 minute episode. And you see the model making skill that is on display in this one episode. Terence the Tractor is brilliant as well. He's an allegory for people being different and how just because you're different doesn't mean you're not special. He gets told that he's ugly because of his caterpillar tracks, and in turn, it's those caterpillar tracks that save Thomas's ass. And it shows you just because you don't look the same or act the same doesn't mean you're not valuable to society. It's an episode that just warms my heart, even in that winter setting, every time that I watch it. And you also get your first cameo appearance of Bertie the Bus. Number 15, James and the Coaches, or James Learns a Lesson for international audiences. James wets the Fat Controller's new top hat with steam and then bumps his coaches so hard that one of their brakes fail. This episode just sums up how much of a ball bag James is for me. He feels all proud and special because he's got his special red coat of paint and is told how good he is because he's a mixed traffic engine, lets it go to his funnel, and then just acts like a complete douche, overshooting the platforms, trying to push Edward along as they double head a train, and obviously spraying water on the Fat Controller's nice new top hat. So of course the Fat Controller's going to reprimand him for it. Again, this is an adaptation of 2 Railway series stories, James and the Top Hat and James and the Bootlace, and put into one episode. But it's more logically done, and it flows quite seamlessly. Number 14, Thomas's Train, or A Big Day for Thomas for international audiences. Thomas wishes he could pull a train when Henry is ill, and his chance comes with unexpected results. I always wondered why it said Thomas looked back and realised that his train wasn't there, because how could Thomas look back? He can't turn his face. The only way he could do it was if they actually unscrew the smoke box and flipped it round, and that's just stuff of nightmares for me. It would have made more sense if it was Thomas's driver that looked back and said, "I bless me, we've left him behind." But then it would also make Thomas's driver look like a dumbass because he should have really noticed that there was nothing behind them before going that far down the line. And that's a change that I like over the Railway series book. The Railway series book, Thomas doesn't go that far before they realise that they've left the train behind and have to come back and get it. He goes much further in this episode, which gives us a chance to see more of Sodor and some of the excellent model making work. It starts Thomas's character arc of him wanting to see the world and go out further than the station yard. And then when he gets his chance, he cocks it up. Number 13, Thomas and the Trucks, or Trouble for Thomas for international audiences. Thomas and Edward agree to swap jobs. However, Edward's train consists of troublesome trucks which love to play tricks. This episode makes me feel uncomfortable to watch, especially when the trucks start pushing Thomas down the hill, and it makes you feel really uneasy and scared. And that's down to two beautiful things: the direction from David Mitton and the incidental music from Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell. When that incidental music changes from the extended version of Thomas's theme to that more terrified, troublesome trucks pushing Thomas down the hill music, that adds to the suspense and adds to the dread and the fear. It's why I said to Mr. O'Donnell when I spoke to him that music is such an influence on your storytelling ability, especially when it's a visual media. It was fantastic. And then at the end, when the Fat Controller turns up, sees Thomas and gives him his scolding, and as Thomas just slowly reverses back onto the main line with the trucks, that music that was playing as well just makes you feel so heart sorry for Thomas. It was a music making masterclass in this episode. Number 12, Down the Mine. Thomas goes to a lead mine to collect some trucks, but foolishly passes a danger board and falls down a mine and needs Gordon's help. The concluding part to Off the Rails and the conclusion of the Thomas and Gordon arc that runs throughout this entire season. In the very first episode, Thomas and Gordon are butting heads, and by the second last episode, which is this one, they realise they've both been in disgrace and they form an alliance to help each other going forward. And the best part is, that doesn't break, even in the multitude of seasons going forward. In the different timelines, they're always on side with each other. They help each other when the going gets tough. That just shows you how great this arc in one season from 1984 was, because it had a substantial effect on everything that came afterwards. While I would love to see the initial pilot of this and find out what exactly happened and how it differed from the finished product, I'm still very, very satisfied with what we've got. Number 11, Toby and the Stout Gentleman, or Toby the Tram Engine for international audiences. A steam tram named Toby and his coach Henrietta meet the Fat Controller and his family on their holiday, but their line slowly closes down. Oh my god, this is a heartbreaking ending. Until you get the letter from the Stout Gentleman, because you just see Toby's entire livelihood being taken away from him. His purpose in life is being squashed and squandered. He's not getting the passengers because buses and lorries and cars are taking his passengers, and Henrietta is now empty. The months pass, he's got fewer trucks, fewer passengers. Then it comes to the last day, where they all come out for a farewell, and you can understand why Toby wished that they kind of didn't, because they know that's the last hurrah. And honestly, if you did not get that final shot with the shed being opened and them saying, "Wake up, Toby, it's a letter from the Stout Gentleman," I think this would have had a massive outcry, just like the sad story of Henry. Because you're basically watching an entire engine's livelihood slowly die in front of him. That is more traumatizing to me than Henry getting bricked up in the tunnel and getting let out in the next episode. This Toby and the Stout Gentleman episode is a metaphor for life. Eventually, everything starts to fade away. You do start losing people. You do become more isolated. You are left on your own. And you do feel like nobody wants you. God, there's so much that you can take into the series as an adult that you never understand as a kid. That's why it has staying power. And these episodes prove it. Number 10, Thomas and Bertie, or Thomas and Bertie's Great Race for international audiences. Thomas meets Bertie the bus, who challenges him to a race. Now, this is a really exciting story. It's not overly bombastic with insane Fast and Furious style, defying physics action. It's a simple, true to life race between a steam engine and a bus. And something that was very interesting to find out when Wilbert Awdry was writing the story of Thomas and Bertie, he got his kids involved in the creation of the story in the race. So if there was points where it wouldn't be seen as Thomas winning the race, because they would be like, right, he's got to stop at a station, or wouldn't Bertie be waiting at traffic lights, which would give Thomas a chance to catch up, he would put it in because he didn't want to pander to the children. And the episode really translates that over. It is a back and forth. You don't know whether Thomas is going to win or Bertie's going to win. You have an idea of the outcome, but it's not set in stone. Again, there is the quote-unquote goof of Thomas with Percy's resin face, but as I explained previously, Percy wasn't on the scene at this point in the series. That's kind of redundant. It's a nice, exciting story with some great directing and editing. The music is fantastic. Well done. Number 9, Thomas and Gordon, or Thomas Gets Tricked for international audiences. Thomas enjoys teasing a bigger engine named Gordon, but when his cheekiness goes too far, Gordon decides to teach Thomas a lesson. The first episode of season 1, and what a great episode to introduce it. I think it was very smart having Thomas and Gordon be the first episode, as I alluded to in Down the Mine. This is where we see the start of the rivalry between Thomas and Gordon, and then Down the Mine has the resolution. Gordon's punishment on Thomas for Thomas whistling rudely at him and waking him up from a sleep, quite sadistic when you think about it. He leaves him attached to a train going at high speed until it looks like his wheels are going to fall off. Potentially, it could have killed him. Although you do find it hilarious because he is stuck and you're just like, I just want to see that little prick get his just desserts. The only thing that I did notice on rewatch was that when you have the scene of the viaduct where Gordon is dragging Thomas along, you do notice that the scenery in the background in the mountains, there is a clear stop of mountains. It's like, here is mountains, stop, other little blue bit. That is nothing bad against the directors or the set design. They basically filmed in a studio at this point that was no bigger than a garage. Space was limited. The fact that that's the only goof that I had noticed in this episode shows how great this season was and how much care they took when crafting this season. Number 8, troublesome trucks, or foolish freight cars for international audiences. James has been confined to the shed but is released to pull trucks. The trucks misbehave, but James does not give up. I've always wondered why the trucks are called freight cars in the US. Is it just because they're cars that carry freight? Well, I am genuinely curious. I'm not being insulting. So if someone from the American audience can maybe explain what the difference is between the trucks and the freight cars, please let me know, because it's something that's always bothered me. Aside from that, the episode itself is okay. It's the resolution that I think should have been the final resolution for James's arc. I also like that there is one change in this from the Railway series story. In the Railway series story, it's just a random pilot engine that brings the trucks to James and insults him saying, have you got some bootlaces ready? And then runs away laughing. In the show, because there wasn't the option for a lot of model engines, because they were about $2,000 a pop to make, it was Thomas that does it. And I think that is really good, because he already had that attitude of being a cheeky little git and did have that little bit of self-entitlement because he had just got his branch line as a result of helping James after his crash. So it was a bit more of a personal dig when he stuck the knife in saying, have you got some bootlaces ready? It gave it a bit more impact on that scene. And I do like all the different things that the trucks try and do to make James give up, but he is determined not to let them beat him. It does show the good parts of the stubbornness of his character, that if he has a point to prove, he's going to prove it regardless. Number 7, Percy runs away. Percy forgets to whistle to the signalman so he could go on to the main line, and is so startled by Gordon that he runs away. Percy's only spotlight episode in this season, and boy, it is a great one. The visual of the close-up shot of Gordon's angry face as he's stopped a few inches from Percy's buffers traumatized me for decades. Just the look of his angry face around the steam that was rising, it genuinely did look like Gordon was going to explode in my young brain at the time. And it just stuck with me. So the scene of Percy just bolting and running away also resonated with me, because that would have been my reaction. Get the hell out of Dodge before he kills you. It's a very suspenseful episode and does make me feel uneasy when it gets to the scene where Percy has dropped the trucks off and is on his way back to the yard before Gordon comes towards him with the express. It still makes me feel uneasy as an adult, knowing that sequence is coming. And that just shows how well not only all of the cinematography and the directing and the music is, but how well Ringo Starr does narrating this episode in particular. It's kind of common lore that Ringo Starr basically narrated the entire series in about 6 hours, which would make you think that it wasn't really done to the best of his ability. This episode, I think, disproves that theory. He seems to really settle into his narrating style in this episode and starts experimenting a bit more with tone, because he's very monotone a lot. Again, not in a bad way. I think that's just because he's trying to communicate it the way that a father would read a story to their child, and maybe adding a couple of flourishes of voices here and there. This is where I think he really started to come into his own as the narrator and realised that if he took a couple of risks here or there, they would actually pay off. Great episode, a great runaway sequence, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Number 6, tenders and turntables. Ever since Thomas got his own branch line, the big engines have to shunt their own coaches. Then Gordon and James get into trouble on the turntable. I love this story because of the political intrigue around it. The big engines feel like they've been done a disservice because Thomas is left to run his branch line. So they don't have their little lackey running around after them, getting their coaches and their trucks and all that stuff. So they feel overworked and underpaid, which is essentially how every worker feels at their job. This is in turn causing a headache for the bigwig, aka the Fat Controller, and the incidents that happen with Gordon having to pull a train back to front because his tender upsets the balance on the turntable because he's not sitting on it right because he's so pissed, is the catalyst to lead on to the next series of events, which is James going on the turntable and being placed just right when it's really, really windy, that he just spins round and round and round and round. Also, I do love the visual of James's eyes rolling around like at lightning speed. When you're a kid trying to copy that, you get majorly dizzy. The only one you don't find out about in this episode is why Henry joined the strike. It just feels like he's tagging in because he's a fellow big engine. That's because in the Railway series book, you do find out that it's because an elephant whooshed him in a tunnel. But that being said, taking it out in this season did not make it feel out of place. I still enjoyed it, and it's the first time that I'd ever saw a cliffhanger episode. Oh, they're going to go on strike. What's going to happen next? And I would always hit that fast forward button to get straight into the next episode. Number 5, Edward, Gordon, and Henry, or Henry to the rescue for international audiences. Gordon goes too fast and bursts the safety valve right in front of the tunnel. Henry is let out to help Edward pull the express. This is the episode, people. This is the episode that proves that Henry got let out of the tunnel. So for all you normies thinking that Henry got locked up for the rest of his days, you just had to fast forward and watch the next episode, and you would have known that your entire point was redundant. Granted, I don't know if he would have got let out of the tunnel at this point if the incident hadn't happened, but there would have been another incident at some point that would have led to Henry getting out of the tunnel. It's a great resolution to this little arc of stories around Edward, Gordon, and Henry. The shock face of Gordon when he burst his safety valve scared me as a kid. I remember I had the book of this and it would just have the still image of Gordon's shocked face, and I wouldn't like to look at it. It gave me nightmares. But it doesn't take away from the fact that I really enjoyed this episode. I also enjoy some little bits of incidental music in this and the previous episode. In this episode, when Gordon says, "Oh look, there's Henry laughing at me," and you hear this little tee 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 bit of music that just sums up that Henry's laughing at him. And in Troublesome Trucks, when Thomas says, "Have you got some bootlaces ready?" and he runs off laughing, you have this little bit of incidental music that sounds like ha ha ha. It's those little flourishes of music in the episodes that make you think nice and shows the dedication that they were putting in the music department. Number 4, Edward and Gordon, or Edward helps out for international audiences. Small engine named Edward feels sad, which makes the crew feel sorry for him and take him out one day. Then he gets to help Gordon when he ends up stuck on a hill. This is another instance of 2 stories being put into one episode. This is Edward's Day Out and Edward and Gordon. Establishes the character of Edward in a positive way and shows the darker side of Gordon, a boastful, cocky, and actually very lazy engine. The reason I say that he's lazy is because I counted how many trucks that he had on his train going up the hill. He had a grand total of 5 trucks and a brake van. When you look at Thomas's trucks and Troublesome trucks, with both of those episodes, Thomas and James both had longer trains of trucks to go up that hill. Thomas did it in one go, James did it in 2 because the coupling snapped, but he's still done it. So it just shows you that Gordon was too proud and lazy to take those trucks up the hill, because he should have easily been able to take those 5 trucks and a brake van up the hill, given his size, his speed, and his strength. It's just something that I noticed on my last watch that just annoyed me. He took half of a train that James had and he got stuck. Number 3, Thomas and the breakdown train, or Thomas saves the day for international audiences. When a new engine called James comes off the rails, Thomas quickly comes to the rescue with the breakdown train, and the Fat Controller gives him a branch line as a reward. This was one of the most ambitious episodes at this point in the season in terms of direction, camera work, and it was necessary for this redemption arc for Thomas. While James being in his red livery and not in a black livery like he was in the Railway series was something that did confuse a lot of fans, it's understandable. As I said, those engines cost a lot to get, and they wouldn't have had the time in the production schedule to give James one coat of paint and then do another coat of paint for his resolution. And if you already had it established that James was on the island and he was in his red livery, that was fine. They just said they gave him a new coat of paint and say it was going to be a brand new colour. So they got around that. I also liked that you didn't see the crash happen on screen. It left it to the audience's imagination to figure out what exactly happened when he came off the rails. I know that they do show it in The Adventure Begins, but you had more technology and better creative control in the years that would follow. At this point, they didn't have that, so they just had to stage the scene. And it was good because it let your imagination fill in the gaps. Number 2, trouble in the shed. The big engines go on strike, so the Fat Controller buys a new tank engine called Percy to help. A lot of people don't like trouble in the shed. That's fine. I personally love it. For starters, it's the introduction of Percy, my favourite character in Thomas and Friends, and really establishes what he is like as an engine. He's cheeky. He's not afraid to stand up for himself, especially to bigger engines that are trying to put other engines in their place. And he's just so lovable. I love the political intrigue of this episode. The idea of engines going on strike to essentially shut down an entire railway until their demands are met. And I love how the execution of this story is played out. The Fat Controller has to find a couple of creative ways to get around this. The first one is getting Edward to push coaches in the yard so that they have no choice but to come out of the sheds and do their job, which also leads to Edward being ostracised by the big engines because they say tender engines don't shunt. They see him as betraying their cause, saying he has black wheels. And those sequence of events then lead the Fat Controller to take another course of action, get a tank engine called Percy, who is shown the ropes on what to do, and then come up with his grand opus. Big engines don't want to do their job, leave them locked in the shed. Thomas and Edward run the main line, Percy goes on the branch line, and it's quite an inventive way to put that little rebellion in its place. I know a lot of people will see it as a dictator not seeing to the care of his workers, but at the same time, those engines are spoiled and they should be doing their jobs that they're meant to do, especially when things change. You either have to roll with it or you get booted out. I always comment on Thinking Man's episodes or Thinking Man's stories. Trouble in the Shed was my Thinking Man's story. I loved picking into it. I loved dissecting it. I loved looking at the nuances and the character work behind it. It showed you how good Audrey was as a writer, not a writer of children's media, but as a writer as a whole, and how he was evolving as a writer. And the number 1 episode of Thomas and Friends, season 1, is the Flying Kipper. Henry is chosen to pull the Flying Kipper, however, ice jams the points and snow forces down a signal, leading Henry to crash. This episode just showed you everything that Thomas and Friends could be going forward. The winter settings, fantastic. Seeing the transitions from nighttime going into early morning, showing the sunrise throughout the episode, the scenery work, the model making skill, the crash itself, fantastic work. In the book, the crash is played off as a joke. You have the crash, and then the driver, who was enjoying his cocoa before Henry crashed into the brake van, gets upset because Henry caused him to spill his cocoa. That wouldn't have felt right in this episode. They played the crash straight. They played it as it being severe and somber. There was no levity around it to break tension. It did what it was meant to do, make you feel sad and shocked that a crash of this nature had just happened. It also gives you the resolution of Henry going to Crewe and being rebuilt in a new shape, which solved his coal problem. As I mentioned previously, when I was looking at it in the analogy of my mental health, I didn't like that twist because it just made it feel like, oh, it can be resolved with one simple fix. But in the terms of the story and the character and resolving a long-standing resolution of him constantly being illustrated in the books in the wrong way and being able to have a consistent basis going forward after that, I really respected it because it showed Audrey's writing skill. He took flaws from a character and used it to his advantage to create superior stories. The only thing I still can't notice to this day, and this is going to be blasphemous to all the Thomas fans, what is the differences between Henry's old shape and his new shape? I have tried so many times to look for the differences between the old shape and the new shape. I do see one, that his splashers are gone, but aside from that, I don't see the difference between the two. If someone could, do a video on it or point me to a video where it's done and go, look, here's both engines side by side, here is where the differences are, highlighting them for me, I would greatly appreciate it. But overall, this episode is brilliant. It showed you everything that could happen if more series were made of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. And luckily, we got it. That's my ranking of Thomas and Friends Season 1. Let me know how you would rank this season, and be sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more videos. And until next time, keep on chugging.